Hello and welcome to everyone today to this special debate that we have with business leader and Dragos. The event is titled, "What Does the Threat Landscape Look Like for Businesses?" We've partnered with cybersecurity giants Dragos to assess the current threat landscape to businesses and organizations across Europe and the world. Leaders are having to respond to macro threats such as conflicts, pandemics and political change, as well as micro challenges around hybrid working, cybersecurity and digital transformation. All of those pose risks, uncertainties and challenges to businesses. So what we're looking to do today is to get some experts to find some answers for that and hopefully give you, the viewer, some takeaways around this subject and things that you can go away and implement in your business. So who do we have on the panel today? We have Sergio Caltagirone, who is the Vice President of Threat Intelligence at Dragos. Morning, Sergio. We have Vicki Bowles, who is a data protection partner at law firm VWV. Welcome to yourself as well, Vicki.
Hi.
We have Laurance Dine, who's the global partner at X-Force Incident Response at IBM. Hopefully I've got that title correct there, Laurance, and welcome this morning. We also have Oliver Chapman, who's the CEO of a very interesting and fast-growing company called OCI, who work across the globe, helping businesses with trade, investment and logistics. I'm really keen to get Oliver's perspective today. We were meant to have Aidan Hancock and Asma Bashir from Network Rail and Centauro Global, respectively, but I think the ongoing pandemic, which was aforementioned, has kind of unfortunately hit them. So they're both unfortunately not going to be on the panel today. So we will kick on, though. We're lucky to have thousands of senior business leaders watching this debate. So it's been a really, really engaging one in terms of sign-ups. So let's get going. I mean, Sergio, it will be great to start the debate with you. And I want to just kind of hone in on your thoughts as a cybersecurity expert. And what do you see as the biggest threats currently to businesses?
I think the biggest threat currently to business, cybersecurity threat, is resilience, and the ability to operate in a fast-growing and continuously changing threat environment. I think one of the challenges we have is keeping up with what is going on, and I think that over the last 3 years, I think some have dubbed it the continuous disaster. As just thing after thing after thing occurs. And I feel like cybersecurity just adds into that as well. And so I think the big thing for us is that in the especially in the industrial industries, we've seen a lot of what we might call accidental outages or challenges. Ones that were not intended to cause outages of gas pipelines or food and beverage manufacturers, but unfortunately did. And a lot of that comes down to just fundamental resilience around, can you operate in a very risky and challenging environment?
Thanks, Sergio. I want to look back slightly in terms of the pandemic. I mean, I'm guessing you must have seen a rise in threats to business, especially with working from home as well.
Yeah, interestingly, Dragos just released our year in review report where we capture data from the last year. Just a great example is in 2020, we found 36% of industrial infrastructure companies that had external-facing, internet-facing connectivity. That was in 2020, so 30%. In 2021, of course, in the middle of the pandemic, we found that number had jumped to 70%. Obviously, for the need for remote communications, remote management of systems, and so I feel like that has changed dramatically, at least in the industrial environments. Again, food, beverage, oil and gas, electric, manufacturing, all of those types of businesses have seen, many, very fast deployment of remote access technologies. And that has caused dramatic outcomes. We did not see major intrusions directly from the internet into these industrial companies during 2019 and 2020. But in 2021, we started seeing a lot more of direct attacks and direct intrusions through internet-facing devices into these industrial environments. So, yes, this has dramatically changed at least the industrial infrastructure of countries worldwide.
No, thanks, Sergio. I've got one more question for you. Then I'll let you have a breather. In terms of what a business can do, so some of the people watching this will be privately owned business, but a lot of them will be big corporates, like you've mentioned, in the industrial space. What can they do to kind of mitigate the threat? I do appreciate it'll be different for each company, but if you could just give us some kind of thoughts around that, and is the subject reaching board level? Is it being treated as something that is really important for a business?
So I'll take your second question first, and then which is, it is not yet, we would think, sufficiently reaching board level. We do believe that the boards are aware of the risk, but we do not believe that the boards are actively managing the risk, which is two separate problems. And so, a lot of people say, yes, we brief our boards and our boards know about cybersecurity. That's all well and good. But until it's in your risk register, until your chief risk officers are involved or your general counsels, until your boards are actively making decisions around cybersecurity, no, your boards are not involved just because they're aware of a problem. The first question you asked, which is what should you do about it? I think the very first thing is that we're still seeing 37% of companies that we show up in who have had incidents have insufficient visibility, meaning they don't know what happened. They're not able to tell you what's going on. They're not able to tell you if they can bring their systems back online safely or securely. So we're still seeing over 30% of companies with complete lack of effective or sufficient visibility. So I would say that's absolutely where we have to start.
No, thanks, Sergio. Really appreciate your insight there. Laurance, I just want to bring you into the conversation now. Good morning. And just get your perspective, your role at IBM and looking at incident response and threat intelligence, just kind of building on what Sergio said. What do you currently see as the biggest threat organizations are facing today?
Yeah, good morning, and thank you all for joining us. So, from our perspective and the data that we gather, either from when we go out and do the responses to major incidents, or some of our partners that provide us information globally, what we're seeing is obviously the ransomware attacks, right? That's just a common everyday thing that we're seeing in the industry repeatedly. The vast majority of the responses that we responding to these days either are, a prerequisite to a potential ransomware attack, or have some sort of ransomware set off within the environment. And the big things that clients have to be aware of is that, vulnerability management is huge, right? The vast majority of 50% of attacks that we're seeing have some sort of vulnerability that let the threat actors into it. Then we also see a significant number, which has been going on for a number of years, through phishing attacks, right? So getting those two things in order are definitely a priority for the customers that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Data theft is also a huge one, and a lot of that is a prerequisite to ransomware or other types of attacks, right? So separate threat actors and groups will go in and steal credentials and information about an environment and sell that on to a separate threat group so that they can go in and set off ransomware attacks. And they work together in those ways, right? And they'll either sell it for a significant amount of money, or they'll sell it for a percentage of what they're going to get from the actual ransomware attack. So we speak to clients all the time around vulnerability management, making sure that they have some form of system in place to make sure that they're getting those major vulnerabilities patched as quickly as possible, but also not forgetting about the ones that are 5 or 6 years old, right? They're still we still see threat groups using old vulnerabilities, and it's still being successful to get into the environments.
No, thanks, Laurance. I was recently interested to read a report that you've done, which had looked at the UK's most attacked industries. After I believe the UK became actually the number one location for cybersecurity. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Laurance, and which industries were particularly vulnerable or threatened?
Yeah, I mean, as you would expect, manufacturing was huge this year. I think Sergio will probably could talk about that a lot, right? Because of the critical infrastructure stuff. And you know what threat groups do is they prey on the people that are going to pay them, right? And manufacturing is very strained because of COVID. You have all the supply chain stuff that's going on there, right? So they're adding weight on top of what's already there. So they have to they put that pressure on them, and they do it in a number of ways, right? It's not just ransomware. That's a major part of it, right? They'll set off ransomware, they'll threaten to set off ransomware, or they'll tell them that they are going to set off ransomware, but they'll also steal data and threaten to release the data into the internet and say, look, we've got this person's information, or we got this company's information. And we're also seeing a third type of pressure, which is through DDoS, right? So you can imagine, right, you're already strained because you're part of this industry that's under pressure because of COVID and everything that's going on there. You have ransomware in your environment. They've got data that they're going to release out into the wild, and then they're also partnering with other threat groups to DDoS you, right? So these are all things that they do to put more weight on at getting these customers to pay for them, right?
No, thanks, Laurance. And just briefly, in terms of cyber gangs and how they're evolving, what can you look into the crystal ball and give us an idea of what businesses can expect in the future, or is it going to be more of the same in terms of how they operate and attack?
Well, they definitely evolve, right? And we've seen that over the years. One of the things that they've probably always done is shared information, right? They've always kind of shared some techniques and tactics, especially once they've been used a lot by the main groups, right? People, they pick up on what works, and you'll see subgroups that'll say, okay, well, we're seeing this vulnerability used and it's working, and people are paying the ransoms or whatever, so they'll pick up on those tactics and those techniques and they'll copy them. But I think what we're seeing a lot more is this ransomware as a service stuff, this, where one threat group, like I mentioned, will go in and their main focus is either phishing or using vulnerabilities to get into an environment, and they'll get domain credentials, and they'll either sell those on to other threat groups, or they will ask for a percentage of any payment that ends up happening, right? So that is something that we're definitely seeing a lot. And it's interesting because we'll go into an environment, we'll do an investigation, and it'll be this one type of threat group, and we know what their tactics are because we've seen them at another. But then as we go through and do the investigation, you actually find out like the initial entry point was, a different type of group altogether, right? And the tactics that they were using, and, even like banking Trojans that we've seen previously used, they're in manufacturing environments, right? They have nothing to do with banking, but they're being used to get in. So, what we're seeing with those groups is they're happy to work together, and they're all getting paid on the back of it.
No, thanks, Laurance. Some really interesting insight there, and building on what Sergio said. Vicki, I just want to now talk to yourself and get your perspective. Building on what Sergio and Laurance have kind of just said there. What are your customers and clients telling you in terms of the threats that they're seeing in their businesses?
So it was interesting listening to everyone talking about vulnerabilities and phishing, because actually I think those are the key areas where most of my customers at the moment are vulnerable. So I call it sort of human error. So it's the phishing type examples where people are getting in. The other thing that I'm seeing from a lot of our customers and clients are the organization themselves aren't subject to any kind of hacking or breach, but a platform or supplier that they use are, and it's the knock-on effect of that, particularly because I work in personal data. So if you've got a a particular platform or something that you're using to store some personal data and they're hacked, as the data controller, you can be responsible for that. And if you don't have the right agreements in place, etc., it can become quite tricky. So it's those sort of two key areas I think that we're seeing most.
No, thanks, Vicky. And obviously, prevention is better than cure. And Sergio did touch on this, and perhaps it's not quite at a board or management level as it should be, Vicky. But what would your advice be to the people watching this now in terms of how they can kind of mitigate these threats and risks?
I think we've mentioned risk registers, and I do think it's really important, and that's sort of a first step, because if you've got cyber threats on your risk register, it just brings it to everyone's attention, and you have to think about it, and you have to look at it in terms of, okay, it is a risk. What are we going to do to mitigate it? The ICO, who regulates data, talks about technical and organisational measures, and I think that's quite a helpful way of looking at things. So you look at your technical measures. So do you have firewalls in place? Do you have encryption if you need it, or whatever those things are? But it's also, and lots of organisations do already look at that, and they think, yes, okay, we've got that in place. We do testing, etc. But it's the organisational side that I usually find is less. Not quite as good as it should be, and that's about speaking to your staff and training them and talking to them about phishing attacks and how to spot them, and not putting your password into an email that looks dodgy or clicking on links and all of those things. So actually focusing on the people as well as the technical side of it, so looking at those two aspects.
Thanks. And just a final question for me at this stage, in terms of, if I'm a business owner, I've been going about my kind of business, and I'm suddenly attacked. What kind of legal recourse do I have, and who should I go to first? Should I go to my insurer? Should I go to the cybersecurity company? Should I talk to you as a lawyer?
So there are legal remedies to, if you've suffered a loss, to try and recover that. But your lawyer isn't the first person I'd speak to be quite honest. The first person I'd go to probably is your insurer to check that you are covered, so if you can recover anything that way. You then need to look at, because if you've had an incident, you'll be investigating the incident anyway in terms of what's happened and how it's happened. And one of the biggest hurdles in this kind of situation is, can you actually identify the person who's caused this, or persons? Because if you can't identify them, you can't take action against them. And it can be hugely costly, because these groups are quite sophisticated. It can potentially cost you more to investigate and find them than your initial loss. So I think there are remedies, but I think you've got to look at first at actually practically, what is this going to achieve? Because if I'm going to spend $500,000 to recover 100,000, it's probably not worth it. Your time is better spent plugging the problem and trying to make sure it doesn't happen again.
No, thanks, Vicky. Some good advice there for our viewers. And I just want to welcome Oliver to the debate. We have focused obviously heavily on kind of cybersecurity, but I want to widen the debate now, Oliver. You work globally with OCI. It would be interesting just if you could start by just telling our audience what OCI do, and then also just what you see as some of the key threats that your kind of clients and people you work with are facing at the moment globally.
Yeah, for sure. And good morning to everyone. Thanks, Ollie. OCI is a company that supports large corporates with their procurement process. So what we effectively do is handle the outsourcing of all things purchased and even sold, and manage that on behalf of large corporates. In my opinion, the supply chain has been rocked to its core throughout the past couple of years. Obviously, we've had COVID. We've had now issues, of course, with the Ukraine and Russian war. We've had huge, great big vessels stuck in the Suez Canal. We've had a real difficult time over the past few years. From OCI's perspective, we've grown from strength to strength. I mean, we're fortunately, I think the Times that a couple of weeks ago ranked us the first fastest growing company in the whole of the UK and third in Europe. And that's a direct resemblance or directly correlative to how the supply chain's been impacted. So we tackle supply chains for customers across sourcing and providing logistical support, and also flexible funding for their business. And the crazy stuff that we've seen over the past couple of years of it's just blown my mind. I mean, I've been importing, exporting for like the last 15 plus years. And through COVID, I've seen and spoken to CEOs of airlines who have changed all of their passenger, normal passenger planes into cargo planes. They've ripped out the seats. They've sent it all out into China, into Asia, loading it up with originally PPE. I've seen the equivalent of EasyJet flights with the seats still in them going over to Thailand to pick up PPE and boxes stacked over seats, put in overhead lockers with all sorts of masks and gloves and kit that's being flown around the world. To see those shifts is really quite insane. I mean, you're talking about a whole industry that's down and can't operate, and then talking about the huge demand for products, creating factories start up overnight in Asia. I don't know, garment factories that used to produce clothes are then producing PPE kit. So these things have had like a real impact on the supply chain. We've had massive demand. We've had a real shortage of logistics. How containers are positioned around the world. The shipping lines do an incredibly complex job of moving containers out of South Korea full of LG TVs over to the UK and Europe, and then they have to reroute them perhaps with scrap metals or whatever. But what happened with the fact that scrap metal yards were closed in the UK and so therefore weren't making exports? What happened to those containers? How did they get back to be able to fill them with cargo again to get these huge volumes of increased products out of Asia? So my number one thing would really be supply chain and logistics. Container prices went up over 1,000%. It used to be $1,500 a container. They peaked at $2,200, I think. That's obviously crazy. I mean, any low value items which were being exported from Asia to the rest of the world all of a sudden couldn't afford to pay the prices. And more expensive cargo was then being filled inside containers in order to make the pricing sit. And those container prices are still really high. So we'll be noticing that now. I mean, if you go down to the supermarket, there are a lot of things that aren't on the shelves. And sometimes we just ask ourselves, oh, why isn't at one point it was toilet roll, perhaps, that was being bought for different reasons, panic purchasing, but they can't replace it. Toilet roll's not worth very much. Filler content is quite light, it's quite bulky, and put it inside a container and you don't get much toilet roll. Make that container $20,000 instead of a couple of thousand, and all of a sudden we can't get toilet roll. It's quite a crazy impact. And then, of course, moving into sort of more current topics, like what else is causing huge disruptions in business. The Ukrainian-Russian situation that's happening right now is really quite wild. I mean, yes, we're feeling it, but we're probably feeling it from an emotive perspective. But what's actually happening in the world? I mean, we've got a country that's invaded another country, and now sanctions are being put on. So what do those sanctions mean? Well, it means that trade has to kind of stop until we can understand who's involved and who's doing what. So let's say from OCI's perspective, we work with the world's largest manufacturer of carbon black. It's an unknown chemical product that is that's like used in everything we have, including like print cartridges and tires and rubber soles. Well, some of those products may be supplied from Russian companies. And do we want to be hit by sanctions? Absolutely not. So we must stop that trade until we evaluate and analyze the supply chain. And banks have to do the same. Enhanced due diligence is now being re-carried out on all of its clients to make sure that whoever's in the network of this complicated global supply chain isn't going to be involved in sanctions. And I think these impacts are really difficult for certain businesses. I would argue necessary, but again, causing massive global disruption. And I think we're still yet to see the fallout from the current situation in the Ukraine.
No, thanks, Oliver. A really good assessment of where you see the kind of global challenges for companies. I just want to touch on one point you mentioned about things kind of being missing from shelves, and often as consumers we take that for granted. Do you see that settling down in the future, or is it something that is just going to continue and it is the new way of life?
I'd love to say that the answer to that would be that it'll settle down. I don't know if that's 100% the case. I think quite a few fallouts will happen. So container shipping lines are cashing in. They've had lean years. I mean, we used to send containers out of the north of the UK for $400, including truck freight, custom clearance, and delivering all the way back to the South Korean example I gave before. So they don't want to be charging that amount of money. That was like a repositioning cost to get the containers back where they need them to handle all of our exports. But I think that they now want to make cash, and fair play to them. How that will settle is undetermined. What I do think it will do is create, and back to the example I gave before, which is, say, if we were to use a toilet roll example, perhaps we'll see factories manufacturing toilet roll inside the UK and Europe. That could be the sort of new norm. But of course, that takes a while to happen. And this was exactly the type of attitude and strategy that Donald Trump put in with his China trade tariffs, which also, by the way, had a huge hit during COVID. It was more expensive to import Chinese healthcare equipment than it was for other products. And I think then eventually we'll see manufacturing increase in sort of Western markets. But of course, those things don't happen overnight. It takes time to raise money. It takes time to take development sites, get the relevant permissions that you need over here. We're not as entrepreneurial as Asia in terms of just being able to turn a business on and go. And so, yeah, I think it will take some time. I would like to think that we'll reach a happy medium, but hey, maybe the toilet roll may cost twice the price that it used to in the future.
No, thanks. Thanks, Oliver, for that insight there. And I just want to, flip the kind of questions again. One thing that did keep coming up with our kind of viewers was sort of the concept of digital transformation. I think that will mean a lot to a lot of different companies. But Sergio, I just want to get your insight into, if you could break that down. It's become almost like a buzzword. But what does that mean to you? And what should businesses be kind of doing to look at their kind of tech stack and make sure it's kind of fit for purpose? Yeah.
And, I think that a point Vicki made, which is evaluating true costs, especially against legal or insurance purposes as well, is critical to understanding what your true risk and value and cost is in a given in any given situation. Digital transformation is a buzzword. I think none of us will disagree with that. But it also is it is an operational term as well. So, I hope nobody finds me on the street and beats me up for using it. But as much as I would probably do it myself. But I think that, it's what it means is that what used to be analog or highly off, what we would call offline processes. A lot of it is coming from the industrial sector, healthcare sectors. And so we see this in manufacturing a bunch, which are, again, processes like, as Oliver was mentioning, manufacturing toilet roll, right? Didn't need, say, the cloud to operate, but is now utilizing it mostly for economical purposes. So you can gain economies of scale by leveraging hosted software or hosted processes, by sending telemetry offsite. Now, you can't do a lot of things offsite. It still doesn't help with real-time manufacturing processes. The lag between data centers still is insufficient generally for, if you wanted to manufacture 50 million egg products a day, like some of my customers do, you're not going to be using the cloud to do real-time manufacturing for like 50 million eggs a day. Those are going to be very close to the manufacturing site. The challenge, though, we have is that I think it's come down to a supply chain issue. And what I mean by supply chain is everybody involved in your business process. It's your managed security service, it's your software suppliers, it's your IT service providers, it's your outsourced legal team. It's everybody outside of your organization who is touching or providing or you're giving access to your organization. And that is what we are talking about when we talk about the increased risk of digital transformation. We're talking about basically increasing your supply chain risks. You're adding more people, more organizations to your organization. When I was the director of threat intelligence at Microsoft, we used to say when we onboarded a new customer into Azure or O365, we used to call it BYOA, bring your own adversary, because every customer that got onboarded into our cloud environments brought whatever threats that they were facing into our environment as well. That is effectively it. Every time you bring in like a SolarWinds or any sort of like I said, any sort of third-party software system into your environment, you're bringing that threat profile into your environment. A lot of organizations are not conducting risk assessments with that in mind. And I think that, you know, we're seeing a tremendous issue with that. But it's not doom and gloom. I mean, in our research, we found that over 50% of ransomware attacks in manufacturing were caused only by 2 ransomware groups, by Lockbit and Conti. And so while it sounds terrible and untenable and unsustainable, when you actually start pulling the data back on what you can do and the scalability of the problem, it becomes tractable. So yeah, while a lot of us talk about all the bad things happening, I also want to mention to people that you can do this. It is reasonable to get your arms around it.
Thanks, a really fascinating insight there, and yeah, Oliver, I think, you know, around digital supply chains, I think something that Sergio touched on there. Obviously, that's your world. Did you want to give some insight there?
Yeah, I think that's, Sergio, super interesting. Bang on the money in terms of the right space. What we're seeing at OCI is a real transition into the world of digital supply chains now. So coupled exactly with the type of support that I think that your organization would need to bring. OCI's focus to, shall we say, the future, obviously we've been very much involved in physical trade, and we see that the world is going digital. So the Financial Times did a research study and learned that by 2025, which is like totally around the corner, the global trade of physical products, so everything that's bought and sold, will be surpassed by digital purchases and sales. So whether that's digital media, whether that's, you know, a billboard in Times Square or in London city centre, whether that's an advert on your phone or downloading Netflix or paying for a film on Amazon Prime, the value in terms of cash monetary volume will be surpass digital, analog, physical, old school supply chains. That's something like, that's quite crazy. I mean, everything that a country purchases and sells, and of course, alongside that, all the support services that will go along with those digital trades. And I think the world is changing in a vast way, and companies around the world need to sort of gear up, acknowledge this space. I mean, we see a lot in the finance industry with banks. They're very archaic. They still use paper, shipping, even the transactions that we're talking about, everything that's physical is still done on physical paper documents, bills of lading, which say, hey, the owner of this piece of paper is the owner of the cargo inside that container. Do not lose that piece of paper, otherwise someone else might own your cargo. How archaic is that?
I think, Oliver, you're absolutely right. And I think, though, I would like to draw the audience's attention, though, that even though things are moving rapidly digital, the foundational processes, and Vicki was talking about both technical and organizational, issues that need to be managed, I think are still there, right? I mean, banks, no matter how digital they move, still have to have a transaction register, still have to have, balance sheets every day, and they have to be able to reconcile every day, no matter what they're using. And same thing with other businesses, right? So while digital transformation scares people, I think from a cybersecurity perspective, what I would like to add to that is that that your foundational, the foundational concepts of asset identification, knowing what is being used in your business, how it's being used in your business, having visibility around those assets, what they're doing and how they're doing it, doesn't change. And so you still use, I would say that, yes, what you're saying is absolutely right, but I think that but how we protect those still still won't change in the future. Maybe some of the mechanics around it will, but the foundational concepts won't.
No, thanks. Sorry, no, carry on, Oliver.
I think you're spot on, because I mean, if we analyze like an old school example, right? You've got let's talk about, again, sorry to revert to banking. Don't mean to go always into finance, but this particular example may paint the picture for the audience. So, we had a person who has money. Okay, let's just imagine this 100 years ago. And banks were formed then, and they would go to their bank and they'd go to a cashier and they'd have like a little bit of paper, well, actually a little book. And someone would handwrite the note of the deposit that they made into their account, and that book would be kept safe and it would tally with the bank records. So Sergio, what that is that's a very real example of a record which needs keeping, which I think is the point that you were making, that the foundation of keeping that record is there. But what we're now totally accustomed to is digital bank statements, and then, more recently sort of apps on phones and whatever. But it's still that ledger, that record of the transaction which came in, which is a person going into a bank and depositing cash. And look how far we've come, look how much things have changed. But I think you're totally right. We're always going to need those basic, the core of what the service is, but it's how we layer it with security and everything else in order to make sure that the consumer or business is protected.
No, thanks, Oliver and Sergio. So I think the takeaway there is don't lose that bit of paper, Oliver. Definitely, that's very important. And just quickly, Laurance, wanted to bring you in on that thread and just get your insight.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I agree with, what the gents have said already around digital transformation and the buzzword that it is, that we have a lot of those in our industry. But, there is a lot of good that comes in with digital transformation, moving a lot of businesses around AI and a lot of stuff that we can do within AI and all that kind of stuff. But what we see on the flip side is, every new thing provides an opportunity for a threat group to find some sort of weakness or vulnerability to attack, right? So we have to, the message we send out is obviously another buzzword, zero trust, right? Like, making sure that your environment is set up in a way that it's assumed that there are threat actors within there, and protecting the crown jewels in a way that makes that possible within your environment. And we talked what Sergio mentioned about when you're adding on cloud and hybrid cloud and all those kind of things that you're adding in new adversaries, and we talk about the same thing as well, right? And we see it a lot within mergers and acquisitions, and a lot of the major breaches you will hear about within the environment or within the industry are the result of that, right? Because you have threat actors that are very happy to sit dormant for a very long time, and a company will buy another company, and something will happen, and we'll do the investigation. But like, well, actually, it was when you plug this company within your environment. And one of the things I wanted to touch on within supply chains and digital as well is something that we, one of our predictions for the future, right, is that we're going to see threat actors taking out people within your supply chain and asking you to pay ransoms to bring them back up online, right? So I think we may have seen a couple of examples of that in already, but I think it's something that's going to happen more often. If you can imagine, if you could get some chip manufacturer and tell Apple, hey, you're not going to be able to make your computers or your chips, unless you do this, that's going to bring some attention there. So that is one of the things that we predict definitely that's going to happen in the future.
No, thanks, Laurance. That's obviously interesting and quite scary, isn't it? As something that could be is likely to happen in the future, like you say, targeting supply chains for businesses. So, a really interesting point there. Vicki, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this thread?
And it's a really dull point, but it's so important. When you're bringing different organizations into your business and you're working with them, look at your agreements with them. And what do they say? So if there is a cyber incident in this third party, essentially, what's your liability? What's their liability? Have they capped it so that they cause you £1 million loss, but under the contract they're only going to pay you £10,000? So it's and it is a thing that we see a lot. People just don't look at the legal terms, and they think, oh, this is a great product, this is a great organization, we'll bring you on board, we'll sign up, that's fantastic. And it's only when something goes wrong that these dusty documents are pulled out, and actually they can be really important in those situations. So yeah, do look at when you're bringing in it won't necessarily stop you being attacked, but it can mean that you can at least recover some funding potentially if your terms are right.
No, thanks, Vicki. Good point there about protection. Oh, sorry,
Ollie,
Sergio.
I could add that to Vicky's point there, which is extremely important. We've talked about vulnerabilities briefly, and most of those vulnerabilities we talk about vulnerability management, but most of those vulnerabilities, the liability of those the technical responsibility of those vulnerabilities lie with the supplier, right? The product developer and manufacturer. But the liability lies with the consumer, right? Those who are buying the product or using the product. And it is one of the challenges I have is that, right, is last year we talked about, or I think it was Laurance that talked about vulnerability management and its importance, which is critical. We spend tens of millions of pounds in the UK and hundreds of millions worldwide on vulnerability management alone. At Dragos, we did a survey, and we have over 30% of the vulnerabilities reported are incorrect, meaning they're being reported incorrectly. Meaning they are not being, even the vendor who is reporting them is not reporting them properly. Meaning if you're relying on the data from the vendor, from governments and stuff who are reporting out vulnerabilities, if you're relying on that to do your vulnerability management process, then you're relying 30% of the time you're wrong. It's weird to say that in what other business are you okay with being wrong 30% of the time, every day, and spending hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds on the problem? You would not be okay with that. You would fight for a solution. And then to go right back to Vicki here, one of the most important conversations I've had in the last 5 years with industrial companies has been with their lawyers, with their compliance officers or their chief risk officers, because a lot of the organizations don't even know that they're holding these risks. And then when I tell them that most of their suppliers don't even have a product security team, anybody in their company that they're buying from that knows anything about how to protect their own products, that they're basically onboarding all of this liability without understanding it, that the insurers are not pricing this into the premiums or into the cost of insurance. And then you look at these contracts that you sign, and you look at all of these limits of liability around it that you're taking on from these suppliers, and you realize that all of us that are buying products from other companies are being left all to our own devices with insecure and insufficient products. And I would say that I'm really frustrated mostly with a lot of the manufacturers and suppliers and vendors of software, of cloud, of so forth, who are leaving every business, probably almost every customer who's called into this meeting, basically all by themselves out there, with nothing but holding the bag, if so to speak. And I think that is a complete and utter disaster of the cybersecurity industry, that we're putting all of this emphasis on what can you do to protect yourself. Well, a lot of the reason that you're having to do that is because your vendors aren't doing anything to protect you or to help you with that problem. And I think we need to shift a lot of the conversation off of why did this company get hacked to why did this other company produce such a poorly secured product.
No, thanks. That is a fascinating point, about the responsibility of the vendors and suppliers there, like you say, because the reaction is why did the company get hacked? But like you say, if the supply chain further down is managed better, then we can kind of mitigate those risks. So, yeah, really interesting for our viewers. Then we are running slightly out of time, but one question that also came in was about cryptocurrency, digital supply chains, and the risk that might continue to pose. I just wonder if anyone wanted to kind of take that point on, the impact that crypto might be having, or not.
Well, I mean, I'll start, but others can jump in, right? So, from our perspective, especially with an incident response, right, the major impact that cryptocurrency has had is the fact that it's not traceable, or at least it's not easy to trace it, right? So these things around ransomware, it means that people can get paid without the threat of actually being found out, but also on top of that, creating cryptocurrency and using hacking into systems and using their resources to generate the processor speed and everything like that. Like, we see that all the time, right? Like, if they're set up well, it's very difficult to see the resource drain. And if they do a lot of them, then obviously it's valuable to the threat groups who are using that resources, right? So those are the two major impacts that we see. But you'd probably, I wouldn't say you'd get rid of ransomware altogether without cryptocurrency, but it would have a huge impact on the ransomware industry if you consider it an industry, which we do.
Thanks. Did anyone else want to add anything on that point? No, that's fine. So, those were the questions that we had, and I just want to say thanks to all our viewers. What would be good if we can go around the room? We'll start with Sergio, then Vicky, then Oliver, and then Laurance. I'm going to put you on the spot a bit here, but just one kind of takeaway that you can give to our audience that will leave them feeling positive and happy to go about their days. Sergio, if we start with you.
If to leave you with one happy thing, right? That first of all, there's good people all over you, all around you, and most people in the world are good, even though us in cybersecurity constantly focus on the bad. I like to say that I'm just the harbinger of bad news all day long, but to realize that there are good people, and there's a lot of people trying to do good work. But fundamentally, I think that the good news here is that we constantly hear about the cybersecurity problem getting worse. I don't know if that's true. Nobody can prove it. And I think that it's bad, and I think it will be bad. I think this is just a problem of management. We're not going to solve this problem. You're not going to solve this problem. So I think if there's a good lining to all of it, it's that, you can do better. It's not impossible. But also don't realize that, like every other business problem, perfection is not the outcome that you should be searching for. And that you should just, like every other risk in your environment, you just need to manage it properly. And then be happy with that instead of constantly harping on all the badness that's going on in the world.
No, thanks. Really good advice there, Sergio. Thank you very much. Vicky.
I think I definitely echo what Sergio said about perfection, because you can't be perfect. We're human beings. At the end of the day, we make mistakes. So my takeaway would be, certainly in my experience, there is a significant number of cyber threats that are caused by individuals not paying attention. And that's something that actually is quite easy to prevent, just with training and making sure you keep on. You'll never eliminate the risk entirely, because, as we've just said, we are human beings and we all make mistakes. But actually, if you can limit the number of mistakes by just talking to your people and making sure that everybody understands what's expected of them, and it's a really simple way of mitigating quite a significant risk in your organization.
No, thanks, Vicky. Oliver, your positive thought to end on.
I revert back to supply chains and how the world's adapted over the past 2 or 3 years. We're very different. We're operating in a different market, a different environment. I think businesses around the world have become more nimble and agile. We've had to transform and adapt in order to deal with the crazy, not just supply chain, but from viruses and everything else that's impacted us. And so the positivity to take away from it is that we're now all working in a much more, nimble and chilled environment. We're more relaxed. We're here on Zoom. We're not stuffed into the city, first thing in the morning to do our round table. People can operate their families in a more comfortable lifestyle while still taking care of the important day-to-day activities within their businesses. So I think the wellness around staffing and their own personal environments is really great.
Thanks, Oliver. That's an important point around wellness there, certainly. And Laurance, last but not least.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say, kind of following along with what Sergio said, right? Like, you're not alone in this, right? Like, don't ever feel like, you're the only person that's trying to defend all of this stuff that's going on, right? So, my advice is go and find yourself a good partner in security that can help you prepare for these kind of things, right? And, there's lots of good companies out there that can help you do that. There's lots of good intelligence out there that can help you prepare. Sort out the risk quantification stuff within your environment, get a partner that can help you get ready for these types of things. So there, it's not all doom and gloom.
No, thanks, Laurance. Yeah, and I think that is a nice note to end on. It's certainly not all doom and gloom. We've had some fascinating insight from our panels. I just want to say thanks to Sergio, Laurance, Vicki, and Oliver. Please do, keep tuned in with the Business Leader Events Network, and also just got to let you know that our Scale Up Awards are currently open for entry. So if you're viewing, please do go look at those awards and submit an entry. But I want to say thank you to all of our viewers and to our panel.